My name's Ben Dellot. I'm the Associate Director of Economics at the RSA. If you hadn't heard of the RSA before, we're a think tank based in central London, but we operate globally. And one of the themes and areas of work that we look at quite closely is the intersection of technology and work. And last year we undertook some significant research which was looking at the impact of AI and robotics on low-skilled workers. And the reason why we looked at this issue, as John was saying, is because there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of hype. You have some people on the one hand who think that this technology will lead to the mass automation of jobs, that will lead to depression of wages, that it will lead to economic stagnation, depressing living standards. On the other hand, you have those who think that actually this is just one more wave in a cycle of creative destruction, and the jobs that could be lost will be replaced by others. And so we thought, okay, well, let's have a view on this. Let's do some research. Let's try to dig behind the headlines and see what we come up with. So when we started this research, we had 4 big questions that we wanted to answer. Number one is, what is this technology? What do we mean by AI? What do we mean by robotics? Second is, what impact will it likely to have on workers, theoretically? And not just in terms of the availability of jobs, but also in terms of things like its impact on pay, its impact on productivity, its impact on job monitoring in the workplace. Thirdly, this is where it gets more interesting, it's what is the impact likely to be in practice? So which companies and how many companies are actually adopting this technology, in the UK at least? And then fourthly, to the extent that we do have automation, how do we have it on our own terms? How do we have an inclusive type of automation which delivers prosperity for everyone? So I think that's a good structure for us to continue with, and that's what I'll try to answer today. In terms of what this technology is, I think I'm preaching to the converted here, but this is a whole variety of different devices and applications under these banners, 2 banners I should add, of AI and robotics. Some of them are household names, some of them we know very well, self-driving cars, self-service checkouts. This orange robot here is the robots used in Amazon warehouses to shuttle pallets and goods around. Top left-hand corner, chatbots used in retail and banking for customer service. On the middle right-hand side, you have Honda's Asimo robot, used to lift and carry patients in healthcare. This funny-looking robot in the bottom middle is used by air manufacturers to install rivets on aeroplanes. And the whole point about showing you this slide is really just to emphasize that we're talking about a whole breadth of technologies which are being seen and being installed in a whole variety of different sectors across our economy. If we look at AI specifically, why has AI become much more powerful in the last few years? 3 forces. One is huge amounts of data upon which to train algorithms. Number 2 is increasing computing power, which does the heavy lifting. And number 3 is new approaches to AI. And these new approaches are effectively shifting from expert systems to machine learning, to some extent to deep learning. And this is where it gets a bit dry, so you have to pay close attention. In terms of expert systems, and Ben, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, I think what we're talking about is algorithms which are based on a series of if-then rules, almost like a decision tree. And it works for quite structured tasks, such as what you might see in early computer games, or in ATMs, or in self-service checkouts. But it's very unsuitable for the difficult, unstructured tasks, such as image recognition, language translation, and so on. And that's where machine learning comes in, because with machine learning, rather than have to write code from hand, from scratch, actually you work backwards and you train algorithms using existing real-world data. So if you take the example of image recognition, you have a whole variety of images, some labeled as bicycles, balloons, trees, humans. You feed that into the machine comes up with a generalized rule to make sense of future images. That's how that works. And deep learning is just an extension of machine learning based on how the brain functions and using artificial neural networks. Now that is pretty dry, so if we can make it a bit more real. Here are 2 questions for the audience, so I don't want you to actually shout out answers to this. Just think about it, because it's meant to be rhetorical. Number 1, can you describe the difference between a table and a chair? Can you explain what makes one sunset beautiful and another not? Now, it's very difficult to actually articulate this in writing or in person. Just to actually describe the differences between a table and a chair, it's just something that we know. Describe the differences between a beautiful sunset and a sunset that's not is something that we know. And this is the problem of, or the importance of tacit knowledge. And Michael Polanyi puts this into a really good phrase, which is, we know more than we can tell. And the reason why this is important is to come back to our approaches to AI. Expert systems cannot deal with tacit knowledge, or they find tacit knowledge very difficult to comprehend. Machine learning is okay because it works backwards from existing data, from real world data, and it comes up with rules based on what we tell it, what we know. So that's the technology. In terms of its impact on the workplace, if you read the newspapers, you'll see every couple of weeks there'll be a new estimate of how many jobs are likely to be automated in the future. You've got Oxford University a few years ago saying it was something like 35, 37% for the UK in the next few years, next 30 years maybe, 20, 30 years. You've got PwC who say it's something like 30%. You've got OECD saying it's 10%, all with different timescales, I should add. And essentially what you have is you have a range from the extremely alarming to the alarming. And we thought, okay, well, this deserves some closer inspection. And we came to the conclusion that perhaps some of these fears are overstated for a number of reasons, and the 4 reasons that I'll spell out today. Number 1 is that AI and robotics still have their limitations. So in the 90s, you had IBM's computer beat Garry Kasparov at chess, which was meant to be a very big breakthrough, and it was a very big breakthrough. But fast forward to the present day, many years on, and still you have no machine which can easily turn the page of a book with ease, easily open a door, easily climb stairs. And this is what is called, and I don't know if I got the pronunciation correct, but Moravec's paradox. And this paradox is that it requires huge computational resources to do quite basic things that we might even expect a toddler to do. But it requires few computational resources to do quite high-level calculations. So we have to grapple with that, and that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen so many breakthroughs, I would say, in every area around AI and robotics. There's 2 challenges which I think are held every so often, which bring this to light. One of these is Amazon Robotics Challenge. So Amazon brings together robotics engineers every year, I think, to try to improve the way that it picks and packs items in boxes in its warehouses. And every year the machines get better, every year the approaches get better, but there's still things that it cannot do. So I think the last challenge found that the machines had difficulty picking up items that could bend, such as books, had difficulty picking up items which are partially concealed. Now, I'm going into a lot of detail here just to make my point that there are still nitty-gritty things which machines really struggle to do, at least robotics in the physical world. The Winograd scheme challenge is more about natural language and common sense and how we interpret particular words. And it puts out a number of questions every so often. And one of these is the town councillors refused to give the demonstrators a permit because they feared violence. Who feared violence? To everyone here, we know that it's the town councillors who feared violence. To a machine, it's much more difficult to interpret that because they don't have all the knowledge that we have, all the contextual knowledge that we have. So that's the first reason why fears over automation may be slightly overstated, because AI and robotics have their limitations. Number 2 is that automation is mostly of tasks and not jobs. So if you take the example of retail workers, say in 5 years' time you go down to Oxford Street, you might expect self-service checkouts to be very common, and that would lead you to think, well, that would lead to big job losses in the retail industry. But actually, as McKinsey points out, every job, most jobs, do have a bundle of tasks, and if you lose one, you actually gain others. So what they point out with this retail worker job, you have someone who has to greet customers, who has to answer questions about products and services, who has to clean and maintain work areas, demonstrate product features, process sales and transactions, and so on and so forth. Jobs are complex, and machines, at the moment, in terms of narrow AI, can only complete part of those functions. A big other factor to bear in mind is that technology complements as well as competes with workers. So in our research, we spoke to somebody who was running a domiciliary care service in East London called Three Sisters Care, and they're working with Bristol Robotics Laboratory to try to create a robotic system which can be installed in the homes of elderly patients. And the whole idea here is that the care workers don't have to do the manual tasks, which are backbreaking, which take time, which mean that they can't do the job that they're meant to be doing, caring, being attentive, actually doing the job of a carer. And this robotic system is meant to enable them to do better quality work, to actually do what they're meant to be doing. You can also see chatbots in call centres, of course. These, at the moment, aren't necessarily fully automating jobs, but they're creating partially automated responses, which then workers can augment and send out themselves. Machine learning used in disease detection, so that doctors and clinicians don't have to actually rifle through paperwork, but they can get quicker answers, and in farming and agriculture, and so on and so forth. And then fourth, this is a more subtle macro, I would say, change that we just need to be aware of, but which doesn't get much attention, in that automation leads to, or can lead to, what you might call recycled demand. So when you automate, you increase productivity, and sometimes, not always, that leads to lower costs. But the savings for consumers, it doesn't mean that they're not going to spend that money. They often spend it either on the same good, or they spend it elsewhere in the economy. So demand shifts, demand is recycled. There was a study about the 19th century garment industry, which is fascinating, looking at the impact of machines, reducing the price of garments, clothing, which didn't necessarily lead to a decrease in the number of jobs because more people bought more clothes because they were cheaper. And it's the same thing with 21st century legal clerks, another study looking at this time in the US, looking at the use of software, legal software. Again, there's a lot of fears around what AI might do to the legal industry, including at Taylor Winters, I guess. And what it showed was that the actual software led to a decrease in prices, which meant that more people were using those legal services. Now, I should stress that this only really works if you have price elasticity, but it's a factor to bear in mind. And then in terms of actual numbers of job losses that may happen, so we did a survey of employers with YouGov. What we wanted to do was actually go to the horse's mouth, actually go to the organisations, the decision makers who actually buy and deploy this technology, to find out what they think and what they're doing. And we asked our private sector employers how many jobs in their sector, in their organisation, they thought could be automatable in theory. And this shows the proportion thinking that 30% of jobs could be automated in their workforce, in their organisation, in the next decade. And we split it by sector. Now you can see that manufacturing, finance and accounting, media, transportation and distribution tend to have a high proportion of employers who think they will see high job losses in their organisation. The ones circled in red, hospitality and leisure, medical and health services, education, have a low proportion of employers expecting high automation. And what binds them together is that they're sectors which are dependent on the personal touch, care, empathy, attention, and so on. So we need to have a look at this in terms of the sectoral differences. Which brings me on to my third question, which was actually what's happening in the workplace. So what we've discussed so far is, what is the technology? What is it capable of? There's a third question which doesn't get so much attention, which is, what are employers, what are businesses actually doing with this technology? And so again, we asked employers a question, which was, are you investing in AI and robotics? Now pay attention to the bottom bar here. You have this first, this chunk here, we call the active adopters. So it's 14% of businesses in the UK who are actively adopting AI or robotics, or plan to in the near future. You've got another chunk to the right-hand side who we call the slow adopters, and they're people who say they want to invest, but it will take some time to do so. Then you've got another chunk who say it's too expensive, another chunk who say it's not proven, and then you've got a whole load who say it's not none of these, which presumably means for some, they're not aware of this technology, it's not on their radar. But there are big differences in between size firms. So large firms, much more likely to invest, as you might expect. Small firms, very unlikely to invest. Why is that the case? So I think there are issues of business models and costs. So in many sectors, in particular low-skilled sectors, it will still be cheaper to use labour rather than machines. Think about retail, entertainment, and so on. I think there's an issue over consumer preferences. So I think most of us would have no problem using our phone and a chatbot to find out what our utility bill might be in the next month or so, or how much our bank balance could be in a couple of months' time. But it would be different if we engage with healthcare. I mean, consumer preferences are always in flux, but for the moment, there's going to be a difference between what people want from different uses of technology in different areas of their lives, and there'll be what you might call cultural no-go zones. Regulation is also going to be a barrier. Everyone knows about GDPR now, coming into force properly in May this year. It's going to cause a headache for anyone who deals heavily in data. A major headache for those who are dealing in machine learning and deep learning algorithms, because there's some rules, it's quite hard to interpret what they mean in practice, around people's rights to know when a big decision has been made about them that's been automated. And this is going to provide hurdles to the rollout of these new AI systems. Just to make this a bit more real, some of you know what this is. It's a droid created by Starship Technologies, and they were founded by the same people who founded Skype. What it does is it delivers parcels in built-up areas, and it's being trialled by a number of delivery couriers all around the world. In London, I think it's been trialled by Hermes. And on the surface, you think, okay, this is simple. You buy it, you rent it, you put it on the street, and then you're good to go. But obviously, that isn't the case. You have to create a new pricing structure to make sure that you recoup your expenses. You have to agree with councils on the use of pavements. You have to find the right insurance so that if this thing rolls out into the middle of the street, you're covered. You need to change your back-end systems to make sure it all works. All of these things need to be covered and sorted before you can actually use this kind of technology. And this is just to emphasize that there are multiple hurdles to the adoption of this technology, and that's why, at least in the UK, we seem to be slow at adopting AI and robotics. I should also clarify that there's a kind of emerging distinction being made between AI on the one hand, robotics on the other. Of course, there's overlap, and a lot of these barriers are bigger for robotics than they are for AI. And these are three machines, devices, which have sort of fallen by the wayside. And what I find quite fascinating is that whenever a new product or service is released, it gets so much more attention than when it is shuttered and when it's closed down. I think this is the case with these three. So Johnson, medical manufacturer, built an anaesthetics machine to automate the process, partially automate the process of delivering anaesthetics. But they had to shut it down because of limited demand. Facebook as well with its AI assistant, and another machine called Tug, which is used to delivering medicines around hospitals. Again, didn't really have great take-up rates, but it's still going, I believe. So, just to recap what we discussed, I think everyone comes to this conversation, I don't think it's true of people in this room, from the outside world, that mass automation is imminent, that we're likely to see huge job losses in the near future, that wages will be depressed, that living standards will plummet as a result of this technology. And this is the science fiction, but actually when you start to look at the facts, when you start to look at the evidence, when you start to speak to businesses, when you start to speak to employees, you get a different perspective. And what this shows us is that actually the UK has the lowest unemployment rate in 40 years. There are now more people who want to work fewer hours than who want to work more. You have declining long-term redundancy rates. They're falling over time. And so, okay, maybe you can breathe a sigh of relief and say, oh, isn't this great? Okay, so machines aren't coming for our jobs, at least for the next few years. We can take it easy. Let's be happy with the status quo. But it's worth also reflecting on what the status quo actually means. So the status quo is stagnant wage growth for most workers. Wage growth is its lowest in over 100 years. You have terrible productivity, particularly for the UK. The UK, I think, lags behind virtually every other comparable country in the G7, G8. And so our perspective at the RSA is actually that the use of this technology can take us to a better world of work where you have better quality jobs that are more humane, which get rid of the mundane tasks, not in every job, of course, but in the round. And actually, this should be something that we should be accelerating. We need to accelerate the adoption of this technology, but to do so in an inclusive manner, to do so on our own terms, which begs the question of how do you actually do that in practice? And a lot of people will jump to universal basic income because it's nice, it's neat, it's easy to understand, everyone can get it. And at the RSA, actually, we're advocates of at least piloting this to see if it has any impact. And we're working with Scottish councils who have now been given the go-ahead to pilot a version of UBI, if they can amass the money. But for us, we need to be intervening across the technology life cycle. So from the point at which the technology is developed to the point at which it is applied in the workplace, through to the point at which it generates wealth and whether we should be distributing that more widely, sharing the gains. So this leads us to a variety of different policy and practice recommendations, everything from a new emphasis on lifelong learning. Everyone talks about lifelong learning. For us, we're talking specifically about the idea of personal training accounts, where every worker is given a stipend of money to spend on a particular accredited training course. So you could be a graphic designer or a carpenter, insurance broker. You can spend it on accredited training, and it wouldn't be too far of a leap from the current apprenticeship levy. And they have a similar scheme operating in Singapore and in France. Cleanup regulation, we need better interpretation of GDPR rulings so that people feel confident to apply this technology in practice. Relocation support, this is a tricky one, but we have to be aware that the new jobs, the jobs that are sustained, are going to be bunched up in certain areas of the country, particularly in urban areas. So now how do we make sure that people can access those jobs geographically, physically? Changing our tax system. So if capital becomes much more important as a source of income in our economy, we need to start thinking about where the burden of tax should fall. How do we shift tax away from income tax and national insurance through to capital? I'm not talking about robot tax because that's counterproductive, but I'm talking about things like property tax, which is immovable and hard to escape. Not everyone agrees with this, of course, but generally speaking at the RSA, we take the position that tax should fall on activities which come about through good fortune or good luck. And if you're in the right place at the right time, that should be taxed more than if you actually put in hard graft and effort. So that's something that we're looking at. We're also looking at this idea of a technological inheritance. Some of you will be aware of this idea of sovereign wealth funds. So the idea that you have almost like a people's VC, which invests in technology on behalf of the public, waits for it to grow to a certain capacity and then pays out dividends. Now, this is much more far-fetched, and it's not a quick win, right? It will take many, many years, but it's something that we're exploring. And then this final point I want to touch on is worker voice in technology decisions. And I think this is a win-win for both the worker and for the employers. If workers feel like they are being listened to, that they have a say in the technology which is being implemented in an organisation, then they're more likely to actually spot opportunities for automation and efficiency improvements. So what does this mean in practice? So Aviva last year ran an automation consultation with its workforce and asked them, do you think your job or part of your job could be automated? On the proviso that if they said yes, they would be given access to retraining. So again, it's meant to be a win-win for both. Exchanging also does something very similar. It's got a very open communication policy. It does roadshows. It sends out newsletters on a regular basis about its technology decisions. This is an interesting one from Carnegie Mellon. So John Zimmerman, helping to create and deploy AI systems which can help doctors decide whether to go ahead with a certain heart surgery, a heart practice. And rather than just create the technology, hope for the best that it will be adopted in hospitals, what he's done is to take it one step further and start to use human-centered design thinking to figure out how do we make the technology work with the grain of workers and the way that they operate. So through observations of hospitals, they noticed something that we might think is quite obvious, but possibly not originally, was that doctors who are meant to be using this technology need to keep their hands clean. They need to be hygienic. They can't be touching machines on a regular basis. Also, there's an issue around culture and hierarchy. Doctors who spent years and years training to be clinicians, training to be experts, don't want an algorithm telling them what to do. And so John Zimmerman and his team were using these insights to try to create a new interface, which, as I said, went with the grain of how doctors and clinicians operate, the culture of organizations, to actually make sure that the technology is adopted. So we're not interested just in what the technology is and what it can do, but also actually how it's adopted. And then just to zoom out in terms of what the government can do, in Sweden they have these things called job security councils, which it's a very social democratic Nordic way of doing things. What they do is have these councils which bring together unions, workers and employers to settle disputes, but they also help to do things like restructure industries when there is a major event. And so this happened in 2011 when Saab closed down one of its factories, or was about to close down one of its factories, 15,000 jobs potentially at risk, but it intervened at an early stage and helped to retrain not all of those workers, but a lot of them. So these are just some of the ideas, some of the inspirational things that are happening, which we might want to replicate more widely in the UK. That's a real quick whirlwind tour of what we're up to at the RSA. There's so much more. I should also really quickly mention, if I've got another minute, about some work that we're doing with DeepMind, which is looking at the ethical implications of AI. So we're running a series of citizen juries trying to tease out and gauge what the public finds to be an acceptable and unacceptable use of AI, where there are real trade-offs and real dilemmas. So we'll be running those over the next few months, with hopefully that completed at the end of the year. So yeah, I'll keep you guys posted on that. That's it. Thank you.